The sun beat down on dry red earth as if punishing the land for its silence. It was a kind of heat that blistered everything in its path, turning sorrow into steam and dust into wounds. In a village set far off the maps, where dust curled in the air like prayers never answered, a crowd had gathered, not to celebrate, not to mourn, but to watch. Before we begin this journey, subscribe, because sometimes the most broken people are the ones who teach us how to live whole again. Now breathe in and listen. If this story doesn't tug at your soul just a little, you might want to check if you still have one. Here on True Soul Stories, we don't do explosions or plot twists every 30 seconds. We do something much harder. We tell real, raw human stories. The kind that sit with you long after the video ends. Love? Hope? Second chances? Yeah, we serve those in quiet doses, with a side of tears and maybe a miracle or two. So if you're the kind of person who still believes in kindness, connection, and healing that doesn't come with a punchline, please consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The girl stood barefoot in the center of the circle, her dress torn, her back exposed to the whip that sliced air and flesh alike. She did not scream. That was what made it worse. The silence, the defiance, the refusal to weep. Her crime? Saying no to a man twice her age who wore power like perfume and believed himself entitled to her future. She was 17, too young to drink in a bar, yet old enough, they said, to belong to someone. The first lash had drawn blood. The second drew breath from the villagers' throats. The third stopped midair, because that's when he walked in. He didn't come on a horse or in a cloud of smoke. He didn't shout or make a scene. He walked into the village square with a limp in his left leg, a worn coat over his shoulders, and a shadow in his eyes that whispered of battles far more brutal than this one. The rancher, the loner, the man who lived beyond the ravine, in a house with no family and a field full of rusted fences. He said nothing. He simply walked up to the girl and took her by the hand. And without a word, without asking, without looking at the stunned onlookers, he led her away. People didn't dare follow, not because they were afraid of him, but because they were afraid of what his silence meant. Back at his ranch, the world slowed. The rancher made no grand gestures, no welcome speeches. He left a blanket on the porch swing, a glass of clean water on the windowsill, a set of clothes that looked as though they once belonged to someone he'd lost. He didn't press. He just let the air between them grow dense with permission. The girl didn't speak for days. She watched the sky like it was reading her soul. She traced the lines of her wounds and listened to the wind comb through dry grass. And at night, when the stars stretched across the sky like quiet witnesses, she placed her hand on the window glass, wondering if anyone, had noticed she was gone. The rancher rose early, chopped wood, fed the horses, fixed the broken latch on the barn door. He moved like a man used to ghosts. She noticed he kept one photograph on the mantel, a woman holding a small child with laughter frozen on their faces. The frame was chipped, the glass slightly cracked, but it stood upright. One morning, she followed him to the fields, her steps tentative, her breath shallow. He handed her a pair of gloves, said nothing, and continued fixing the fence. She knelt beside him. The work made her hands ache, but it grounded her, post by post, nail by nail. She didn't know his name. He didn't ask for hers. But healing, it seemed, didn't require introductions. Over time, she noticed things. He never entered the house with his boots on. He hummed old cowboy songs when the wind picked up. He kept a small drawer full of letters he never mailed. At night, he stared at the fire like it held answers he'd stopped trying to question. And she slowly learned the rhythm of the place. The way the kettle whistled before dawn, the creak of the barn door in spring wind, the way silence could speak louder than voices ever did. It was on the 14th night that she spoke. Not a sentence, not even a full word, just a name. Lana. He nodded, as if he had known all along. Lana began tending the garden. It was half dead when she arrived. The soil cracked, the leaves brittle, but she watered it anyway, sang to the tomatoes, whispered to the squash. In time, green returned. Bloom followed bruise. She found an old guitar in the attic. The strings were out of tune, the neck slightly warped, but she cradled it like it was something sacred. And when she played, quietly in the evenings, even the horses seemed to listen. Months passed. The villagers had long stopped speaking of her. The man she refused had moved on, embarrassed but not changed. The world spun forward, as it always does. But on the ranch, time moved with intention. She discovered a room filled with paintings, rough brushstrokes, mostly landscapes, stormy skies, lonely trees, a river that ran off the page. She recognized the style. It matched the tattoos on his arms, delicate script, weathered color, a story painted into skin. One painting was different, tucked away behind the others. A portrait, a girl, eyes soft, hair braided, a scar beneath the chin. It was her, painted before he ever saw her. The next morning she asked, "Why was I there?" He looked at her long and deep, then motioned for her to follow. They walked past a barn, past the fields, to a quiet clearing with a small stone, a grave. He knelt. "My daughter," he finally said. "She would have been 17 this spring." Lana sank beside him, the earth cold beneath her knees. He didn't cry. Neither did she. But the wind around them felt like a sigh, let go after years of holding in. That night, she added a flower to mantle, a single wildflower she picked from the edge of the field. It sat beside the photo now, like it had always belonged. Spring melted into summer. Lana learned how to ride, how to mend, how to trust her voice again. And he learned how to laugh, not often, but deeply, together. They built a new kind of silence, one that held space, one that healed. Then one morning, as dew clung to the grass like memory, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dark coat, black horse, dust rising in their wake. Lana froze, her eyes locked on the figure, her breath caught in her throat. The rancher stepped forward, hand grazing her back with reassurance. The rider dismounted. A woman, older, tired, but familiar. Lana whispered, "Mama?" The woman nodded, tears already tracing the dust on her cheeks. The rancher looked between them, his face unreadable. Lana took a step forward, then paused. The twist was never the pain. It was a choice, to stay or to leave. The moment hung heavy, like a storm holding its breath. And that, dear listener, is where we must pause. Because some stories don't end with answers. They end with the courage to choose. Subscribe, because next time you'll hear what Lana did next and how love sometimes comes back wearing a familiar face. The winds had changed overnight. What was once a dry hush over sand and sagebrush now carried the scent of coming rain. On the edge of the desert plain, beneath a sky smeared with bruised purples and molten gold, the loner rancher stood by his barn, his silhouette framed against the twilight like an unanswered question. And beside him, seated on an upturned bucket, was her Adira, the girl once marked by shame but now quietly reclaiming her story. The ranch had become a kind of borderland, where silence was safer than stories, and where healing did not ask for permission. The first days were cautious, like a stray dog watching her hand move toward the food bowl. She barely spoke, but her eyes tracked the rancher's every move. How he spoke to his horses, how he repaired the fence without frustration, how he left a cup of tea by her door each morning and never once asked her to earn it. She spent hours staring at the old saddle hung in the corner of the barn, the leather sun-bleached and cracking, its stirrups uneven with wear. It had once belonged to his younger brother. That much she learned by accident, an old photograph tucked between the pages of a manual on horse birthing techniques, of all things. A boy no older than 16, wild eyes and wind-tangled hair, seated atop that very saddle. But the rest was a story the rancher hadn't yet told. Adira's own story sat behind her eyes like a wolf pacing in a cage. The sting of the whip had faded, but the sting of betrayal from her own father, his silence as the villagers bound her to the post, had carved deeper scars. Her refusal to marry the man who had bought her for 2 goats and a bag of flour was a declaration no one had expected, and in the eyes of her town, unforgivable. But here, the horses didn't flinch when she walked by. The chickens didn't judge her with tilted heads, and the rancher, still unnamed in her mouth, gave her space like a man who understood the weight of memory. One morning, rain finally arrived. Not a storm, but a steady, soaking rain that turned the dust to clay and made the wooden porch moan beneath their boots. She stood in the doorway and watched it, her hand unconsciously touching her back where the scars lived. Behind her, a kettle whistled. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black, no sugar. She accepted it without a word. But something cracked in the silence. "Why don't you ever ask?" she said softly. He looked at her, not startled, but like someone hearing a bird return to a tree it hadn't perched on in years. "Because sometimes questions pull at stitches," he replied. From that day, the silence became less of a wall and more of a thread connecting 2 people who'd been unraveling alone. She began working alongside him. At first, just feeding the goats, gathering eggs, then slowly mending a torn saddle, learning how to check the water lines, riding the fence perimeter with his old mare Clara. The land responded to her, like a whisper finding its voice. One afternoon, while hauling hay into the barn, she found the boy again. Not the boy in the photograph, but a memory spilled open, a box of letters tucked in the loft, bound with twine. She wasn't snooping, not really. The lid had come off when she tossed the bale too hard. She opened one, then another. They were written by the rancher to his brother, long after the brother was gone. Letters never sent. "Clint, if you'd stayed, you'd have loved this rain," one read. "The fields are soft again. Your old mare still kicks the fence post at dusk like she's waiting for your shadow." Adira returned the letters, tied them back up, but something in her shifted. She now knew why he didn't speak much. Because part of him was always still writing. That evening, she placed her own offering on the porch, a small drawing, rough but honest. A girl, arms free, standing on a hill beneath a sky not unlike today's. He saw it when he came back from feeding the cattle. He didn't say anything, but the next day, he brought out his guitar. He hadn't played since Clint left, or maybe since Clint's body had been found in the ravine 2 years after he vanished with a stolen truck and too much whiskey. The notes were broken at first, hesitant, but then they settled into something that sounded like forgiveness. Adira hummed along, a lullaby from her childhood surfacing on instinct. 2 songs, one aching, one remembering, met in the dusty twilight. From then on, the evenings were filled with firelight and sound. Not loud, not frequent, but enough to make the walls of the old house breathe again. She began carving wood. Small things. Birds, horses. Even a little fox she left on the fence post with a mailman's son who always watched her shyly from the dirt road. The rancher started writing again, not to Clint, but to someone else. He wouldn't say who. And just when it seemed the past had been folded into something almost livable, the past knocked on their door. Literally, it was her father. He looked older, but not kinder. A man weathered by guilt, not softened by it. Behind him stood 2 men from the town council. She saw the rope in his hand, and for a moment, time snapped back into its cruel costume. The rancher stepped between them. "She stays," he said. "She is mine," her father replied. "She is not a thing to be owned." The standoff was not loud, but it echoed. The councilman stepped forward. "We are here to ask, not take. The town has changed. There are those who wish to apologize." Adira's breath hitched. An apology? For pain tied into every breath she'd taken since? Her eyes met the rancher's. "I'm not going back," she said, not angry, just sure. "No one's asking you to," the rancher said. She turned to the councilman. "You may return your apology to the earth. That is where you left me." Her father tried to speak again, but the words clattered and died. They left. She sat on the porch until long after the sun dipped low. The rancher sat beside her, a cup of coffee in hand, steam curling like small ghosts between them. "I think," she said, "I'm ready to give this place a name." He nodded. "What will you call it?" She thought for a long while. "Clint's Hill." He smiled. Not a big one, but one that traveled through him like spring through dead branches. They painted the sign together. planted lavender beneath it. And with each season, the ranch grew not in size but in soul. The little fox she carved became part of a collection she sold in the market. Her drawings turned into journals. He fixed up an old barn and made it into a classroom for the nearby kids who didn't like school buildings. One morning, she received a letter from her mother. She didn't open it right away, left it beneath her pillow for weeks. When she did, it said only, "I couldn't stop him, but I never stopped hoping you'd forgive me." Adira placed a letter beside the carved fox on her nightstand. And one dusk, many months later, when the guitar played and the horses leaned against the fence like they, too, were listening, she leaned into the rancher's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not asking my name that day." He nodded, "Because you let me name myself again." The wind shifted. The past did not disappear, but it softened, like rope that had once bound but now just held a swing on a tree. Before you go, subscribe, because sometimes healing doesn't gallop like a hero. It arrives quietly, under a roof mended by callous hands, with a girl who dared to stay, and a man who dared to make space for her to grow.